A lot of times, God will bless us with the thing, and then because we get bored easily, or because we don't see the results we're expecting, we pick up another hobby. We want to do this, we want to do that, when you're not even done with the assignment that God has blessed you with to steward in this season. People thinking, oh yeah, she's doing her thing. Whole time, God never told you to do that. You look successful to everybody else, but God is like, I never told you to do that. Hello, welcome back to Christ-Centered Creativity, the space where faith and creativity meet. I'm your host, Jada Simone, and here we edify you, encourage you, and inspire you to create within God's will and to execute the ideas He has blessed you with. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about how to be multifaceted without being distracted. Being multifaceted is a gift from God, but if what you're pursuing and working on is not God's will for your life in that season, then it can just be a distraction from what He's actually calling you to focus on. How many times have you found yourself picking up projects, putting them down, creating this, then you want to create that, and it seems like you can never focus on one thing or get anything done because you have no direction, but you have so many interests. I know for me, this has definitely been a struggle as someone who's skilled in multiple areas, but God has really been teaching me the importance of focusing on what He told me to focus on and not being strayed away by my desires and what I want to do. So today we're going to talk about the importance of discerning the season that God has you in creatively, creating a plan with God once you know where He is calling you in this season, and executing with faithfulness and intentionality. So let's talk about how you can discern the season that God has you in creatively. James 1 verse 5 tells us that if we lack wisdom, we should ask God. The number one way for you to know what God is calling you to focus on in this season creatively is to ask Him, to pray. If you feel drawn in this area or that area, or you just feel confused, ask God for confirmation. Ask Him for direction. He doesn't want you confused and laboring in vain, putting your efforts in things that He never calls you to do. Well, you could just ask Him. Ask Him for wisdom. An example of this is maybe you're a graphic designer, but you also know how to sing, and God is calling you in singing in this season. And with that, you may not be able to spend so much time on graphic design because God really wants to strengthen your singing skills. And this doesn't mean that He will never bring these things back up again. It just means in this season, whatever season that God has you in, He wants you to focus on these specific or this specific area. And I know as creatives, there's this temptation to pick up a little bit of everything, because we can, and you can learn so much, but again, it can be a distraction. Another practical tip outside of praying and asking God is a lot of times He already told us what we should be focusing on. It just isn't what we necessarily wanted to hear. You may feel drawn in an area that you don't feel qualified for, but you can sense that God is calling you there. But because you don't feel qualified and going in that direction, and you're used to what you're doing, you ignore what God said because you're comfortable where you're at. You're comfortable creating in this medium. But no, God is calling you there for a reason. So don't ignore it. Maybe God is calling you to work on something that's tedious, and you want to do quick, small projects because it gives you this feeling of accomplishing things. But in reality, it's distracting you from what God has for you in this season. And everything God has for us comes in season. And the last thing you want to do is create things out of season. And sometimes we can move out of impulse, and sometimes we're just easily influenced by what everybody else is doing. You see somebody on your For You page and they said they went to Hobby Lobby or Joann's to get a new sewing machine, and you're like, I want to sew too. I want to learn how to sew too, but that may not be what God is calling you to do in this season, and it is just a distraction. Another way to sense that God is pulling you away from certain creative pursuits to other ones is Him closing doors and closing opportunities, taking away those clients that you had, taking away those graphic design clients or those clients that you had for paint commissions. Sometimes God literally has to take the opportunities from us to be obedient and to get our attention. Because a lot of times, again, we heard what He said, we just don't want to do it, or we don't feel comfortable learning something new, or That's just not what we expected for him to be calling us to do in this season. But like we said in the last episode 1, this creativity is not ours. So when God is telling us to put certain things down and pick other things up, that's just what we do out of obedience. Now that you sought God for wisdom and you have a better idea of what he's calling you to focus on creatively in this season, now it's time to plan with God. An emphasis on plan with God, because a lot of times we'll hear him say, okay, this is what I want you to create. This is what I want you to do. But then it'll be tempting to just start it without seeking further wisdom on how he wants us to do it. And the best way to do that is to plan with God. Planning isn't about controlling the narrative or doing everything perfect. With a plan, you now have something in place to help you not wander and get distracted by side projects. And it gives you confidence in knowing, okay, this is what God told me to do, and this is how God told me to do it. Proverbs 16 verse 3 says, "Commit to the Lord whatever you do, and he will establish your plans." He will establish your plans. In that, he also needs you to be obedient and to focus on the thing he has you stewarding in this season. God's plan will filter out what your desires are versus what his desires are. Proverbs 16 verse 2 says, "All a person's ways seem pure to them, but motives are weighed by the Lord." Like I was saying earlier about you feeling impulsive and you may be easily influenced when you see other people creating certain things and think just because you have that desire to create that too, that it came from the Lord. And that's not always the case. God truly knows our motives, and he will tell us if what we're going after is out of selfish ambition or just us being impulsive, or if it truly came from him. So an example of planning with God is you writing down the idea that he blessed you with, writing down what he told you to focus on in this season, and then planning with him, praying to him, asking him for wisdom. Okay, God, you told me to start this business. What's the mission statement? Who's the target audience? Who are you calling this business to speak to? Is my target audience women? Is it men? What are we doing with this? Ask God for clarity and write it down. Another example of this may look like you asking God as a writer. You may be a writer, asking him, God, you're calling me to write this book. How many words a day should I be writing? What word count should I be reaching by this month? You told me the book launch date is this day. What am I meant to do between now and then? How am I meant to market this? Asking him for guidance on all of these things. And again, planning with God, not being led by our own desires when it comes to what to create, but being led by the Lord. Also, be open to things changing. Be open to setting goals and then God being like, that's not what I want to do. Let's pivot here. Let's do it this way. Be open to change, because at the end of the day, this is his plan, not ours. And the final point I want to talk about when it comes to being multifaceted without being distracted is to execute. To execute on the ideas that God has blessed you with in faithfulness and in intention. Execution is where creativity and discipline come in. A lot of times, God will bless us with the thing, and then because we get bored easily, or because we don't see the results we're expecting, we pick up another hobby. We want to do this. We want to do that. When you're not even done with the assignment that God has blessed you with to steward in this season. Multifacetedness can honestly, in disguise, be you wanting instant gratification. There's nothing wrong with having hobbies. It's more so your intent behind having those hobbies. Because if you paint on the side of doing whatever else God has called you to do, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you find yourself painting all the time during times that God told you to focus on something else, then it does become a problem, because it's almost like you're avoiding what God has actually called you to do, because you do feel like painting brings you joy, or you feel like taking pictures bring you joy, or you just feel like you're better at that than what area God's calling you to do in this season. Proverbs 21 verse 5 says, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty." First of all, let's talk about what diligent means. Diligent means having or showing care and conscientiousness in one's work or duties. And conscientiousness means the quality of wishing to do one's work or duty well and thoroughly. Right there in Proverbs, we should be doing what God has called us to steward diligently, not moving in hastiness, not moving quickly, impulsively, picking up this, picking up that. No. with intention. Moving with intention and being faithful in what God has called us to steward in this season means we can no longer put things off when we get bored. We can no longer put things off when we don't see the results. We can no longer spread ourselves thin doing this, doing that, when God never told us to create those things. And it looking good, people thinking, oh yeah, she doing her thing. Whole time, God never told you to do that. You look successful to everybody else, but God is like, I never told you to do that. Some practical ways to start executing is to start breaking that plan that God has blessed you with for that business, for that YouTube channel, for that podcast, down in small tasks. When you break things down, it makes it feel less overwhelming. You need to have God as your accountability partner, but you also may need actual people and community to hold you accountable. Of course, with the wisdom of the Lord, if He told you to tell these people, ask them to hold you accountable. Ask them to do check-ins. Hey, God told you to start that clothing line. Have you started it? Have you started the logo? Have you started looking for someone to start the logo? Accountability is everything. Another practical tip that we may overlook is to celebrate small wins. Going back to what I said earlier, a lot of times we pick up other creative projects and we use being multifaceted as an excuse to be distracted because we don't see success, quote unquote, in what God currently has us doing. First of all, the fact that God has us doing it and His hand is on it is already a success. And on top of that, celebrating the small wins will give you contentment in where God has you now, and to understand that small beginnings are still beginnings. So let's recap what we talked about today. Number one, being multifaceted is a gift from God, but it requires discernment to know what God is calling you to create and focus your time on in this season. Number two, having a plan helps you navigate the distractions and keeps you in alignment with God's plan for your creativity in this season. And number three, execute with faithfulness and intentionality. Stay committed to that project that God has called you to work on in this season. Do not let your impulses to want to create this and that too distract you from what God has blessed you with to steward. Because being able to steward these creative projects is a blessing. God is literally trusting us to bring heaven down to earth through these creative projects. He blessed us with the opportunities to steward them. So it is a blessing and not a burden. So let's act like it. Thank you all so much for tuning into the second episode of Christ-Centered Creativity. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. And let me know in the comments what project you're going to be focusing on and you're no longer putting down and being distracted by other creative pursuits. Also, if you're listening on Spotify or Apple, be sure to give your girl a 5-star review, and be sure to follow the podcast on Instagram at Christ-Centered Creativity Pod. Thank y'all so much for tuning in. Stay blessed and stay creative, and I will see y'all next week. Bye.